in the Urban Design Lab was actually her idea and her initiative that got us started on this in the first place. So we owe a great deal of thanks to her. I'm sure there are others, but anyway, I will stop and pass it along um, so we can get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So the event today, from emergency patchwork to the long term, is an attempt to continue talking about Beirut and its needs. The abstract that we put together focused on, looking at the needs of Beirut after 2 years of economic crisis, the pandemic, and the August 4, 2020 port blast. Ever since we noticed that emergency initiatives such as remittances by the diaspora or the actual transport of essential supplies through commercial travel have temporarily relieved the Lebanese community ecosystem and crumbling infrastructure. However, with no centralized or national organization in sight, such efforts are nothing more than patchwork solutions. And this is where our conversation is starting. So the livelihood of communities in Beirut today and beyond are really hinged on this very unsteady lifeline of supplies, be it food, medication, clean water, energy, and more. And our main question is, how can these initiatives of emergency patchwork transform to longer-term solutions and sustain systems that lead to prosperity? We have a great lineup of activists and people working in development, as well as urban planning and design, and much more in scholarship that are trying to find ways to make this happen. So here's a brief introduction of each of our panelists. And then each panelist will have a few minutes to present a short presentation, and then we will kick it off with some questions. So Amina Merkbawi is a former board director and Beirut Disaster Relief Fund Committee representative at Impact Lebanon. Born and raised in Norway as half Lebanese and half Norwegian, Amina started to develop a strong connection to Lebanon during her first trip 5 years ago while volunteering in a refugee camp in Beirut. Her passion for humanitarian work further unfolded through her engagement as a volunteer in Shatila refugee camp, as a mentor at Environment Academy, and involvement with several non-governmental organizations in Lebanon. With an interest and an academic background in emerging economies, and international development, Amina obtained her master's researching aid effectiveness in Lebanon at King's College London. Now she is based in Beirut, working as a youth innovation manager at UNICEF, which involves providing innovation and entrepreneurship opportunities for vulnerable youth, as well as applying innovation and creative thinking to humanitarian programming. Our second panelist is Elias Khalil, who is a member of Muwatinun wa Muwatinat fi Dawla, MMFD, which stands for Citizens in a State. It is a progressive opposition party in Lebanon. MMFD's specific aim is to turn the unfolding crisis into an opportunity for the formation of a secular, democratic, just, and potent state in Lebanon. Elias is based out of Canada, where he's an assistant professor of industrial engineering at the University of Toronto. Our third panelist is Manal Kahale. Raised in Lebanon, Manal studied landscape architecture at the American University of Beirut and holds a master's degree in lighting design from Parsons School of Design. She worked in the US for 4 years before deciding to go back to Lebanon and try and bridge both worlds through lighting. However, her return to Lebanon was much more difficult than anticipated with the unfolding economic crisis, the pandemic, and finally the August 4 port blast. This catastrophe unlocked feelings of communal support, triggered by the complete absence of any relief efforts on the part of the Lebanese government. And as a result, Manal decided to use her knowledge and experience to partake in relief efforts as a citizen and a lighting activist. Thus, Light for Lebanon was created in partnership with Light Reach, a program focused on providing rapidly deployable solar lighting solutions to support the residents of Beirut affected by the August 4 explosion. Our next panelist is Saj Yazigi, who is an architect, urban planner, and head of Yazigi Atelier since 2005. He's also a regional consultant in sustainable development in Mashriq and Maghreb countries. In parallel, Yazigi acted as a senior consultant for Dar al-Handasa, Talib and Partners in architecture and planning projects in Lebanon and the region between 1999 and 2009. He has led several projects financed by international organizations in relation to urban renewal and strategic planning in Lebanon and the region. In 2007, he founded Majal, the academic urban observatory at Alba, University of Balamand, with the aim of facilitating research and assisting localities in the formation of adapted development strategies. He has also directed several publications in relation to planning law and regulation. Currently, Serge is an adjunct professor of urban planning and design at the American University of Beirut. Serge holds a PhD in contemporary history in the field of urban renewal from the University of Bordeaux, France. Finally, last but not least, Yara Akari is an international development professional with more than 10 years of experience, including 6 years working at Arc Finance, where she was a project manager supporting renewable energy and energy access projects for the Inter-American Development Bank and USAID in Haiti, Uganda, and Kenya. As a consultant, she has expertise in project management, market research, business development, strategy design, monitoring and evaluation on topics including access to finance, community engagement, energy access, and climate change to agencies such as GIZ, USAID, UNDP, and UNESCO. Yara works as a consultant and team leader at GreenMax Capital Advisors in New York, and is also managing a women empowerment initiative between Senteur d'Orient, a private soap company in Lebanon, and the UNDP. The initiative consists in training, mentoring, and increasing opportunities for low-income women in Lebanon. Yara holds a Master's in Development Studies from the London School of Economics and a Master's and a Bachelor in International Economics from Paris 2 Panthéon-Assas University. And I will have Iyad introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Maureen, for the brief introduction for the speakers. I also want to thank Ziad Jamaldeen for joining us. People who don't know Ziad is an educator and practitioner. He teaches at Columbia. How are you? We're going to start with the presentations by the panelists, and then later on we're going to move to the questions. Please, it's going to be organic, a conversation. Everyone, please share your thoughts. We'll start with Amina Markabi.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. I believe there was supposed to be a presentation. In the meantime, I'm just going to start. I just want to briefly introduce everyone to Impact Lebanon, the organization itself. It's funded by members of the Lebanese diaspora in London. Following the Beirut uprising of October 17th, and the organization is 100% volunteer run. It composes now of a diverse group of 120 active members. The mission of the organization is to act as a hub for initiatives that deliver a positive impact for Lebanon. And yeah, thank you. Can move to the next one. Yeah, so here you can see some of the areas, some of the members are coming from all over the world. It's very bottom up, grassroots driven. And it, is actually drives by this collaboration between organizations in Lebanon and the diaspora itself. Following the Beirut blast, the organization set up quickly a crowdfunding campaign. We raised about exactly to $9.2 million. So as a volunteer organization, we quickly had to put in place organizational and procedural measures. We launched a fund strategy and set up fund transfer processes, fund allocation and monitoring teams, and developing key partnerships to extend our capabilities to deliver the fundraiser's objectives. Eventually, we ended up funding 18 different NGOs within 6 verticals: residential rehabilitation, heritage rehabilitation, micro and small businesses support, livelihood, medical and hospital support, mental health, and community support. On this topic, speaking about how these emergency initiatives can transform into long-term solution, we think it's a key question to ask about aid dependence, where many argue that assistance of this kind of nature can pose a barrier to the country's development and sustainable economic growth. And you rarely hear about countries becoming developed by aid. You can often rather, on the other end, hear about countries becoming dependent on aid, intentionally or not, but when it's used as a long-term strategy, it can inhibit development and progress and reform. So on this note, I would like to distinguish between emergency aid and development aid. And for impact, this disaster relief fund was a major turning point. We saw it as a unique emergency situation, and we had to rethink our role in the context of the broader ongoing civil society efforts in Lebanon. And we long-term decided to focus on our goals, which are driving civic engagement and political awareness in the diaspora, as well as building the capacity of institutions and individuals in Lebanon. Just to mention a few initiatives that we have, which is Sauti and Environment Academy. Thank you.
Thank you, Amina. Elias.
Yes, thanks, Iyad and Maureen. And thanks to the GSAP Collective for Beirut for inviting me. I'm representing مواطنون ومواطنات في دولة, or Citizens in a State in English, which is a political party in the opposition that was formed in 2016 in anticipation of the coming economic crisis, one which we now know retrospectively that there were many indices for that were, of course, ignored by the ruling parties and also by foreign powers who are interested in Lebanon. And unfortunately, at the time, Muwatinun's plea was not very effective at moving the state of affairs towards anticipating, recognizing, and potentially avoiding the crisis, which we came to experience in very ugly ways since end of 2019. But there arose this opportunity for our political party and other opposition parties to seize the moment and grow and try to actually form an alternative, a real political alternative which can get enough support and backing to make an impact. So in my presentation, I will try to relate our political objectives and goals to the questions of this panel, of this meeting. So the main question posed here is the following: the livelihoods of communities in Beirut and beyond are hinged to this unsteady lifeline of supplies. How can these initiatives transform to longer-term solutions and sustain systems that lead to prosperity? So in this panel, I try to argue for the following answer. Through our involvement as concerned citizens, and here I don't mean just myself, I mean also other Lebanese citizens and or residents on the call, our involvement within a well-defined transformative political project that can quickly lay the foundations to a civil state and initiate economic reconstruction on the basis of the interests of Lebanon citizens and residents. So there's lots of fancy words in there, and I'll try to break them apart in the next few slides. So by transformative political project, I'd like to contrast that with patchwork alone. So patchwork in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. In certain circumstances, such as following the August 4th blast, some patchwork was definitely needed and necessary in the absence of a functional state and also lack of financial resources to support any kind of reconstruction or emergency measures. But patchwork alone will not be sufficient in the long term. And this, I will argue, hopefully later on in the panel, is due to really just simple material economic reasons. So it's not bad on its own, it's just not sufficient. It might be necessary in some cases. And also transformative stands in sharp contrast with certain theories of change from inside the system, which have been kind of advocated following the formation of the Hassan Diab government a year and a half ago, where there were many PhDs on the cabinet, many supposedly highly educated, experienced, private sector experienced individuals there that ended up really not doing anything for most of the term of this cabinet. It was not active at all. And in the one instance where it did anything, which is one economic plan, the same plan was shut down by the same political parties that brought this cabinet about. So change from inside is not possible, hence the need for a project which is transformative and political in nature. Another keyword here is quickly. So time is of the essence. What I'd like to contrast that with is three other scenarios. One, which other individuals or opposition groups advocate for, is long-term incremental change. The idea that society might be sectarian, might not have recovered from the aftermath of the Civil War, and so on and so forth. Hence, we need a process of re-education that starts from the bottom up, that might take a generation or two before its effects kick in. There's a clear counter argument to that, which we hold, which is that we would like to save as much of our current society as possible. The costs of that are not factored into any plan for long-term incremental change. So one must set the basis for protecting what we currently have. And by that, we don't mean just material resources, but individuals, people, etc., before we can start thinking about long-term incremental change. The other element that is also kind of in a race with any quick transformation is the risk of local regional settlements. So this is something that we are literally at the risk of at the moment with the Mikati cabinet, the risk that what happened following the Civil War in 1990 happens again, where the main states that are at conflict supposedly in Lebanon come to an agreement and decide to refloat the same sectarian ruling political class to the detriment of the population. And third is the mass forced immigration and increasing poverty that is accelerating day to day. And any kind of long-term change will really not be able to help those people. The people we are losing now to good jobs abroad, or those who are taking risks with their lives, getting on small boats to cross to Turkey or Greece, we might never get them back. And that, we think, is a crucial factor to think about. So when we say a civil state, there's two main words here, civil and state. Starting with state, we believe that there was never really a state in Lebanon. So the illusion that we've had a state and potentially we can tweak a thing or two and get there is for us extremely unlikely. We've only had kind of this mishmash of sectarian leaders that just handle the interests of their groups at different times, not really any form of central state. By civil here, and there's a nuance with civil and secular, but we use civil to say non-militaristic and a state in which citizens deal directly with the state, not through mediation with a sectarian leader or church or any kind of religious sect authority. And so this stands in sharp contrast with the current sectarian arrangement, and also other less thought out arrangements, ones which maybe undermine the the existence of a strong central state. We believe that for a small country like Lebanon, such a state is the only viable form for governance in a democratic state. And we need to initiate economic reconstruction. This is also in contrast with relying eternally either on foreign political dollars, so said Paris 1, Paris 2, said 3, etc. All these initiatives which ended up actually funding the system, which collapsed on our heads. Also, eternal reliance on expat transfers. We know that's a function of global economic conditions, and also on partial sectoral solutions, small fixes in one of these sectors that I'm listing here. So these are all non-tradable basic services. Any solution that only hits one of these is probably gonna affect possibly negatively others. So thinking about education alone without public transport is probably not gonna do it because people can't get around, and this is a problem we're currently facing. And last, the focus on the interest of Lebanon's citizens and residents. This is in contrast with the interests of individual sects. This is how the current political class sees citizens, not as citizens of Lebanon, but citizens of particular sets, and also the interests of foreign powers who might at times seem to be, wholeheartedly looking to help Lebanon, but really we need to think of them as external powers with interests, and us as an internal power with its own interests. And the process that happens after that is one of negotiation with other nations. And so that's our political project, one which we think could benefit from, all of you's contribution and interest. And I hope to argue for that more in the coming panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Elias. I think we're going to discuss a lot about the role of architects and designers adopting a political project later on. So that would be very helpful. The next person is Manal.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Let me just put it on PowerPoint. So first of all, thank you for having me here today. I'm here to talk about Light for Lebanon and how it is both a short-term and a long-term solution for Lebanese in those times of need. So first of all, I'm going to talk a bit about the problem, and I'm going to take you a few steps back. And for those who are not very familiar with the situation today, Lebanon has undergone some huge changes in the past few years and still is. And we are going through one of the largest economic crises, political instability, the explosion, the power outage, not to mention the pandemic and shortage of fuel and whatnot. And all of this has led to some drastic changes in an urban setup and identity. And we can see this in our homes, on the streets, in the communities with the people, and in our cities that have now turned into ghost towns. And these changes translate in lighting questions. So everyone, not just lighting designers, understand the consequence of the absence of light. Theft increased. There is already PTSD available all around, not available. There's a negative impact on the economy due to the closure of businesses, restaurants, shops. And as lighting designer, we looked at the impact of the blast on the lighting situation. And the questions we have asked ourselves are, first of all, what can be done now as an individual to remedy the sudden darkness? And this is taking into consideration that there is already an existing grid, that there are other aids that we don't know, we're kept in the dark of where they're going to be implemented. So we wanted to make sure not to overlap in our efforts and making our efforts temporary or go to waste. The second question we raised was what can be done now towards the long term? And this is making sure that there's existing products, it's affordable, and of course, with the future of design, sustainable, which led us to the third question, what do we need to rebuild a sustainable Beirut? So I was drawn to solar lighting. And of course, when we're in a state of emergency, we don't reinvent the wheel. So I reached out to my former thesis advisor, whose NGO operates a global solar lighting initiative for communities, which have been done in Haiti and in Puerto Rico. And we partnered to launch the Light for Lebanon program. So you can see over here, we have Light for Lebanon applies light tier model, and we have 3 scales. The 3 scales are, first of all, the portable lights, which are very quickly distributed for homes, for school, for cultural promotion in terms of playing around, having kids play around with light and use it in different ways. We also have security floodlights that are used at building entryways and also in architecture and landscape, depending on the projects and what are the needs. And we have the street lights, which are used for brightening up the streets and the public sector. Now for the process, so for any intervention, first of all, we need to, what we needed to do is establish, first of all, jurisdiction, which must be coordinated with some governmental entity. In our case, it was the municipality and the army, since Lebanon was going through the emergency relief situation. So we filled out the necessary administration and legal paperwork. We then collaborated with NGOs that are already on the ground and connected to communities, because we need to help each other technically, and then engage with residents to hear out their needs and best address the community's context. Let people as well guide us towards the places they use that need to be revived with light. So when we are doing a project, the first things we look at are, first of all, of course, the location. We look at the road width and collaboration with and coordination with the building heights to see if there's enough sunlight coming in, and seeing the community to know who really is living there, how are they using the space. And we have a lack of public spaces in Lebanon. So just seeing the informal gathering spaces and listening to what are the spaces people want to use. So we started then by doing a site analysis. I'm leading the team on the ground, and our US team includes expats who are the fundraiser ambassadors and helping us raise the funds. And then we have a Light Reach team, which administrates the program and handles the logistics. We work with the volunteers to survey the night condition, and we test our products to make sure that the tools we're using are powerful enough, and if not, how to use them, where to use them. And we met with several NGOs to explore the opportunities and partner on existing and future renovation and reconstruction projects. And you can see over here, it was based on just literally going door to door, seeing what's out there and seeing how our products will start making an impact, hopefully, on the ground. So for the program implementation, we typically follow a collaborative process, and all the installations are done with our partner NGOs and local residents and any volunteer on the ground. So the portable were door to door, where we started handing them off. That was the fastest intervention. And then the security floodlights, which sometimes were used, as you can see in the picture here, for anytime with a sensor, anytime anyone enters a building, it goes to full brightness, or sometimes for landscape purposes, whenever we had canopies blocking any entryway or road. And the street lights, where we collaborated with the Live Love Beirut and installed a road leading to a hospital. So other than anything that was needed on the ground, we also, urban lighting is important, not just from a utilitarian viewpoint. It is also important for placemaking, and projects become beacons for the surrounding communities. So we are designing light for architectural and landscape projects, where you can see landmark buildings, where we were testing out which tools will be best to start highlighting those and create beacons in the city and bring back life. Or going towards any place that has a potential to be a gathering space and recreate a public space by using the landscape and highlighting those beautiful elements that make our city unique. We also believe that the vision and mission of Light Reach is that light is about life after dark. And we consider that art and culture are an essential part of life. So we also try to intervene as much as possible with anything that revives the community itself and makes them want to stay in Lebanon or use their get a little bit of hope in those dark days. So we have, for example, we partnered up with Nusanid, where we had a project with Participate, a group of foreign students that wanted to create a little space for children to play in Burj Hamoud. So we used the solar lights of different scale, the 2 first scales, and try to make it useful even at night. And then we also did the temporary art platform, which was reviving a forest abandoned along the river of Beirut, and try to use the products in the most creative way possible, and making sure, of course, always keeping in mind vandalism and all those things, and maintenance, which which you can. I'm not going to waste your time with all of that, but it's all taken into consideration, which you can check out in our social media or websites. Thank you.
Thank you, Manal. Now we'll go to Serge.
Yes, hello. So thank you, Iyad and Maureen, thank you, Risa, for this invitation. Actually, I will definitely react as an urban planner, which I mean, this is my main hat. Even though also I'm a political activist, but we might talk about this a bit later. So when the blast happened, I would like to show you two plans that were circulated few weeks. Most of you are quite familiar with those plans. So it kind of subdivided an already very much fragmented area, socially, economically, politically, communitarian, confessionally fragmented, and very much vulnerable. And those were the plans that were kind of trying to organize the work of all the NGOs, local, international, regional association working on the ground. And Maureen, you can show also the 2 others. I mean, they reproduce all those subdivisions, and this raised our fears actually. And several of colleagues, friends of mine also, we started feeling that, do we really want to be turned into another Haiti? And we had, some of us had the opportunity to be part of the discussions that were led by international organizations and I mean major stakeholders that wanted to contribute or felt that they were concerned by this reconstruction effort. And the motto, I mean the discussion, what we tried always to bring back on the table is that, please, don't put the government aside. Whatever is our differences and situation, and whatever is our political opinion of this government, needless, I mean, to elaborate on that, but definitely, because my generation of urban planners was conscious about the reconstruction of the downtown by Solidaire, a private company, and Majal that I founded was founded in the aftermath of the Israeli war of 2006, and in the objective also of monitoring reconstruction. So we said, come on, guys, we learned from previous reconstruction. There's a limit of what others can do if we don't put on the table national institutions. I'll go back to that point because actually some of the international and major stakeholders kind of reacted positively to our discourse up to a certain point. But meanwhile, also we collaborated with Colombia very quickly. I had this idea of organizing, to try to have a comprehensive approach in the reconstruction. Colombia World Project also showed interest into that. And we organized something like 8-9 major conversation, which brought also on the table something like 300 international experts on topics like public spaces, heritage, port reconstruction, infrastructure, and so on. And they elapsed for several months with the objective of kind of formulating a global vision for the reconstruction. But meanwhile, also that was done so with the Beirut Urban Lab, to which I'm also affiliated. And also the Beirut Urban Lab kind of started pushing forward for a new discourse. So trying to promote the recovery notion as to in opposition to the reconstruction, stating that recovery might be more fitted to what is happening. And they took, I mean, under the lead of Dr. Huwaid al-Harisi, so a group of experts started working on the Quarantina and are still working there with this bottom-up approach, and trying to say that recovery also entails the social and economic dimension and not only the physical rehabilitation. And it's definitely a long process. So each time trying to say we learned from what happened, and even though the work done by NGOs is incredibly important, and we compare some of them as being heroes because they really worked into very difficult conditions. And if they were not there, I think the situation would have been really, really terrible. So, but we need to reflect on a different dynamic, okay, as urban planners. And the funny thing is that if the state didn't actually react positively to us asking the state to act and to react and to assume its responsibilities, but they were very much interested into another project, and that was the port. So I was also assigned by the Order of Engineers and Architects to prepare the working sessions on the port reconstruction for the urban declaration of the OEA. And there we discovered that many actors were coming with plans, and that actually behind the scenes, local central institutions were very much interested. And they were pushing forward for those plans and saying, we are eager to take responsibility and to play our role. So this discrepancy, which is quite terrible and very much unfortunate, between a project that could bring some money and could kind of open the appetite of some investors versus those very much important neighborhood where the state said, no, I'm not interested, let the others work and do their responsibilities. So I will stop here just to respect my few minutes, but I'm definitely eager to react on all those points later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Serge. Last, Tiara.
Yes, hello. So I wanted to actually do something a little bit different. I, of course, as a Lebanese, I'm aware of obviously the current situation, and I have experience working in Lebanon, but I thought it would be interesting for me to share, let me share my presentation, to share some work that I have done recently in Haiti, and kind of to present an example of what can be done. I'll make that slide bigger. Okay, what can be done in a country that has actually some similarities with Lebanon. So I just want to make sure you're seeing the full screen. So here, so I've worked for several years in Haiti. That was right after the earthquake. So as probably most of you know, there was a huge earthquake in 2010. Haiti is already a country where there was a very low access to grid electricity. At the time, it was 28% of the population. And same as Lebanon, I mean, there's a high level of remittances. So very, big diaspora community, mostly based in the US, Canada, most of them were actually sending money to Haitian back in the country, and a fourth of this money, of those remittances on a monthly basis, was actually spent by the local household to buy gas, kerosene, to be able to have some sort of energy source in the house. So and so, as you probably know, I mean, Haiti has also, unfortunately, a lot of similarities also with Lebanon in terms of the issues with government, with corruption, a weak public sector. And so there was a huge focus on humanitarian solution at first, especially post the earthquake. And so I worked on a project that I think is interesting here to share, especially that we want to look at sustainable models and long-term solutions. So I thought, okay, I'll share this example. So in this project that I worked on, we were trying to find a more sustainable way to link remittances to actually a solar product for two reasons: to get people to, give access to people to reliable and safe source of energy, and also to avoid like all the issues with climate change, of course, and the problem with deforestation and the use of kerosene, and the issues with also using candles. So I know now in Lebanon, as Manal also explained, there's a huge issue of like access to light and energy, electricity. So basically in this project, we were trying to not donate. And that's one thing that I want to highlight is obviously after events like earthquakes, there's a lot of donation, right? So all the emergency initiatives that are in place. And one of them in the case of Haiti was donating solar light. And what happened a couple of years later when we tried to put together this project working along the private sector is that all those donations kind of spoiled the market. And there was two things. It created dependency on aid. I mean, of course, when it came to food as well, and a lot of different things that were donated or helped Haitian at the time. And it also created a distortion of the market. So you're not incentivizing the local people to actually pay for something, but they're expected to have it as a donation. So basically, in 2 words, that project we put together was trying to find a link between the Haitian diaspora, the remittances sent to the country, and enable them to place an order directly for a solar home system with a couple of lights, sometimes mobile phone charging, radio. Sometimes it comes with TV sets. I mean, there's a bunch of things that you could do with a solar home system, and trying to also find financial mechanisms so Haitian could afford the system. So that was like working with a microfinance institution, or sometimes the solar product provider would provide some type of financing, payment in installments, in 4 months, 5 months, 6 months or more. And so basically the reason why I'm talking about this is really I was trying to see, okay, what are the main differences between, humanitarian intervention, which is of course very needed, but then when you look at long-term solutions, and of course it takes more time to design and then implement a business model, but it requires market research. It requires what is really crucial is the identification of the local and international partners, and draft all the agreements. But usually the business solutions are involving the public and also the private sector, and the focus here is really on the private sector, as I know Lebanon has a lot of smart, engaged community. The diaspora is also very engaged in helping Lebanon. And so I think that putting all this private sector in use, especially at times where maybe the public sector could be a little bit of an issue, could be great. It's a great lesson learned as well for Lebanon. And so as I think a few people mentioned in our presentation, too much aid can kill aid in a way, because you're not incentivizing people to find local solutions. And I think what we learn now with the blast and the issue with the currency and everything is you need local solutions. You can't rely on importation all the time, or so yes, so I think and the last point would be the whole education, awareness raising, capacity building is also key. And that's one of the key of the success of a sustainable solution versus a more short-term patchwork solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yara, and thank you, everyone. Now, Maureen is going to start with the questions. The one thing that I want to say, it's thank you for the impressive presentations and looking at the different scales of interventions and dimensions that impact the livelihoods of the residents of Lebanon, from architecture to political, urban, economical, and looking forward for the discussion. Maureen.
Thank you, Iyad. One of the first questions we had prepared for the panelists is, in the wake of the precarious socioeconomic and political situation exacerbated by the pandemic, as you know, the Beirut port blast and the banking system failure, the country has been witnessing numerous emergency relief initiatives, as we saw in these presentations, as well as a grassroots organization to aid community initiatives, including rebuilding efforts, in-kind distribution of goods, resort to sustainable energy solutions, fundraising efforts, and much more. So our question really is, so from your experience as either a giver or a receiver and or an observer of such initiatives, what do you think are the structures, bureaucracies, and logistics needed for these initiatives to actually strive? And another question, follow-up question to that is that how do you find communities are reacting to such efforts? Here I can see a lot in, a lot of this in Amina's work as well as in Ilyas's work, but others, other panelists are also welcome to jump in. Go ahead, Amina.
Thank you. Like you said, yeah, it's been part of our work for sure. And especially in an emergency situation when there's a lack of governance, you really you lack all these structures and bureaucracies and logistics that is needed. Eventually was started to develop slowly, but in the immediate response, it would have obviously been very helpful with rules and regulations, quality and standards, especially when it comes to reconstruction of buildings and infrastructure, for this to happen in a safe and a secure manner. Also do no harm policies in place, and in terms of effectiveness of the delivery, to have established coordination and collaboration in place as well. And all of this, especially when it comes to these immediate grassroots and NGO response, it happened kind of organically after time. But on the second note, when you asking about the community's reaction, the communities and the beneficiaries in these houses were kind of left as a decision maker on what kind of support do you need, what can you actually receive. There were NGOs visiting people in their homes, asking them about their needs. Several NGOs were, doing these assessments, visiting people. And you're leaving the communities and the individuals as a decision maker of what kind of aid do I need, what can I get, how do I wish to receive it. They don't know what kind of quality they will receive. Are there any rules and regulations in place? And this was questions I can imagine, for the individuals that were approached by these NGOs. There was so many of them, as you know, on the ground responding to the blast. So for these initiatives to really bring on good impacts, there is definitely a need of rules and regulations, logistics, and for aid to lead to development, it needs to complement the strategy, a national strategy, and an overall plan that fosters sustainability and development. And from Impact Lebanon's side, when we were selecting NGOs to receive funding, we hired a third-party vetting and quality assurance organization to guarantee that the supported donations reached apolitical, non-sectarian, transparent, and proficient NGOs.
Thank you, Amina. I just have a quick follow-up question. So what was the process that Impact Lebanon went through to identify those beneficiaries that are not secular, not politically affiliated, et cetera?
That's such a good question. So we got 150 applicants. We first of all selected based on the proposals. We had a partner in Kudirat that helped us skimming through the proposals. And as you know, that we were based in diaspora, we didn't have the full overview of what's happening. It was very messy. So we hired this third-party organization called 3QA to go to the NGOs. They gather all the information, the financial data, what they've done in the past, their registration documents. They interviewed them, went to the background of every single member, and really digged into the organizations to make sure that non-sectarian, apolitical, and all these requirements were met by the organization before signing any MOU.
Got it. Thank you so much, Amina. Would anyone else like to jump in for this question?
I can go.
Go ahead, Elias.
Manal, do you want to go?
Manal, we can.
No, it's okay. You can go first.
Okay, thanks. So one of the keywords in the so I'll speak first as an observer of these let's say emergency efforts, but also as a receiver through my parents whose home was damaged on August 4th. So I got to see, although from distance, how they benefited from immediate aid. We're talking on the next day, basically. Help with picking up glass and just stapling some kind of half door to just close things off, and temporary housing with family and all those things which many people have had to go through. And this speaks to my initial point in the presentations, that such efforts we view are in many cases necessary but not sufficient. And so if we think about emergencies, two things come to mind. I really would like to minimize the chances of having more and more emergencies, maybe hopefully not some other blast or even climate emergencies, which many places in the world are kind of bound to run into in the next few decades. And we might be victims of that with maybe sea level rise in the Mediterranean or things like that. So there are things we can control and things we can't. If we wanted to have proper emergency preparedness, then of course there's a role to be played by a state which anticipates in advance possibilities. Think FEMA in the US. And of course, Lebanon does not need anything like FEMA, given its scale. So it's in general a much simpler case than most countries, which maybe the countries we live in, which are much larger and much more exposed to such possible disasters. So there's that need, and even within NGO type contributions to relief after following emergencies, the question of just the basic logistics is also an obvious one. You cannot put together, a transportation network overnight if you wanted to, just chart a path to the transportation of certain basic materials and goods. That is something that should be kind of put together or set in advance as part of national development policy, right? Which could also benefit from external help, but that's something that you plan out over, at least years, if not decades. And so from the perspective of individuals who are contributing to such initiatives, for us, the question should be, where does my effort or this bounded number of hours that I'm able to spend offering my services to Lebanon and its people, what's the best place to put in that effort? And we think that putting all of that effort into only, relief initiatives, again, however necessary they may be, is possibly not the best use of your time and energy. And at least part of that should be, part of that effort should be spent towards something transformative, which we think can only be a clear political project, and we hope to be offering one such political project among others.
Thank you so much, Elias. There's a lot to digest there, and I see links already with the conversations that have already been presented. We will hear Manal's response, then we'll call on Philippe and Michele.
Yes, sorry, I had a small power outage here. But so I just wanted to bring up just one topic about communities reacting to such efforts. And speaking of a sustainable solution, and solar in particular, there was a lot of skepticism at first. And our solution was to push really hard towards a pilot project to prove that it works at first. And the second part of it is give ownership to people. Because we have two techniques when we want to install the solar lights. It's either on existing poles that are owned by the municipality and the government, or on facades of buildings. And of course, we tried as much as possible to keep the involvement easier via residents and facades, and give them ownership and let them know that this is their product, this is theirs to take care of, and keeping them as involved as possible helped a lot in creating more awareness and helping push that effort forward. So it was just this little aspect I wanted to make sure, because communities, it was really important to involve everyone around us for so many reasons, including theft and vandalism. All those things is important to start by the people themselves. So that's.
Thank you, Manal, for this very on-the-ground observation. Sometimes we talk about ideas and concepts, and we forget that it's actually people's lives that we're trying to improve, and it really starts with how they receive some of these efforts that these initiatives are trying to achieve. Next, we'll go Philippe De Corte, who is actually the head of UN Habitat Program Development here in New York City, and played a big role during the studio, as well as with the publication with Professor Richard Plunz and Professor Victor Bodie-Lawson. Take it away, Philippe.
Thanks, Maureen. I must say the question is very difficult. And Serge and I had a long conversation on this, which is partly captured in the publication. And so maybe a couple of thoughts building on the presentations. One, I mean, we know that the way society was functioning in Beirut before the blast was far from perfect. It partly created the conditions, it created the conditions for actually what happens, and then the collapse afterwards. So this challenge of the operating environment that was pre-blast, far from perfect and dysfunctional, I mean, that should never be forgotten. The blast is not 0.0. The blast is just a moment in a crisis that was happening already for quite a while. And so being able to craft a response that takes into account the pre-crisis or pre-blast condition, I think is important. Although exactly I talked to Serge, I mean, his point is important. You have to deal with government, with whatever government or governance you have in place. You cannot ignore it. So I think that's his point for me was very important. Again, in a way, to finding maybe this is an opportunity to create and change the dynamics a bit, change the dynamics between communities and government, the position of private sector. So it is a moment to kind of reshape the power dynamics. But I think it has to be done involving whoever is in charge at that point in time, because they have to be held accountable and they have to be part of the solution at that point. The other thing that came to mind listening to some of the presentations is that, and specifically in Lebanon, again, because it's a pre-crisis asset, this incredible capacity to innovate, this incredible capacity to be entrepreneurial. It's a quality and assets of Lebanon and Lebanese people. And how do we know that is an asset? How do you harness it? And I fully agree. It's by making sure that from the early days, you're looking at this also from how can the private sector come in a positive way, moving away as quickly as you can from the kind of charity knee-jerk, I mean, charity first response you get, because on day two, you need to help people. So you need to be able to supply things that people can't afford, that people don't have access to. But quickly, I think it needs to exactly evolve into how do you rebuild, use that assets of bottom-up creativity entrepreneurship that exists in Lebanon. And so I was interested and happy to listen to the presentation on the lightning that was made. Thirdly, I think also this issue of yes, and that's where I'm happy that somebody with the Haiti experience on the call, and we talked about it with Serge. You get this wave of NGOs, all good intended, but you're living in that street and you're getting 5 people knocking at your door asking what you need and then disappear. There's something fundamentally wrong with that, because that's not how society works. That's not how you're going to help people. And so in a way, there is this bigger question: how do you create a framework that whatever initiative that is coming up, whatever energy you create that is part of the response, you harness it in a way that ultimately becomes transformative, that deals with immediate urgency, but somehow starts to add up, does change what happened before. So that maybe you push to more energy efficient or more kind of greener technologies. And this is what the design studio tried to do. How do you make some of this transformative? And I think that's the question I think we should also be discussing a bit more going forward. But back to you.
Thank you so much, Philippe, for this really deep observation. This wave of NGOs, I remember, started arriving in 2011 with with the start of the Syrian crisis, and this was one of the first moments in at least the past couple of decades where this was this giant wave of international organizations and international aid flooding and people knocking on doors. They were not knocking on the doors of vulnerable Lebanese, but they were knocking on the doors of shelters of where refugees were living, and I feel that has taken a complete backseat after the blast. It's almost as if like one misery on top of the other, and I'm actually surprised to see that many of those same NGOs that were shown in Serge's map, that were working on the for shelter of refugees, have actually shifted to rebuild efforts after the port blast. I think Michele, who is the WHO Techne coordinator, who also contributed to the publication and was part of the process leading up to this event, would like to say something. Go ahead, Michele.
Thank you, Maureen. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. And I think like I tried to follow up on what like Philippe and also like Amina and someone else was saying before. Like, I think, we are just talking about the response. We are just talking about the blast, right? But as was mentioned previously, what happened before in Lebanon is decades of dysfunctional governance, right? So, and that is, it to be addressed in somehow. Plus, all the COVID pandemic, right? The blast didn't appear in the middle of a easy, let's say, easy time for Lebanon, for the world in itself. And again, I feel that including, several UN agencies, and of course several, and I'm part of the UN agency, and several non-profit organizations, developing organizations are just running behind the response, right? So we will be always late in all of that if we are not trying to plan something, because we know that something is happening and will happen. We don't know exactly when and where, but we know that in certain countries and in certain regional areas, they are more vulnerable for certain type of hazards. There are scientific maps on that, from the climate to the complex emergencies, right? and conflict. So when we are doing this planning, I think it's extremely important to, first of all, engage a different stakeholder, but trying to avoid that this is becoming a business. Because I'm very curious to follow up and understanding what will happen with the reconstruction in Beirut. And in general, like how the country will be started to get up from this nightmare, no? So of course that we have to involve the private sector because where there is the money. But how and how we are going to control that there is not a misusing of funding in relation with the different stakeholders, including international organizations, right? Including international organizations, not taking this out of the mass, let's say, including the donors, because I think it's our, and I hope we are trying to do it, but of course everything is always low. How we are going to educate the donors to funding the right activities. It's very easy to funding response because all donors want to have a picture with a crying baby. I'm sorry to say that, but it's the truth. Very interesting what's happening in Mozambique that was always affected from flooding for many, many, many years. But the time when Mozambique started to receive a huge amount of funding because of the flooding was actually after a photo taken from the helicopter, like showing a pregnant woman giving birth on the top of a tree, right? So how we are going to educate the donors also on started to fund it, also the preparedness plan. And this preparedness plan, of course, have to be done together and in collaboration with, actually they have to be the main actors, like local governments, regional government, and of course, community. Because if you don't involve the community will not react in a moment that there is a response because they don't feel that it's their preparedness plan. They don't know what they have to do. And you cannot just educate the community after the response because it's too late. You're in a wartime. So I think connected also to the to what we are also working a bit more on the health part, and this also the way I contribute a little bit on the publication. I think it's very important that we are not trying to do and doing always the same error. Let's try to build on the lesson learned. And it's not just, the same phrase that we always say in the humanitarian sector, right? But really we have the experience and we have the possibility to do that. Now, the pandemic could be, of course, it's a disaster, but it could be a real possibility to make change. And what happened in Beirut with the blast, it is a possibility to rebuild the city in a more equal way. And I think this also that is very important because we are talking about the reconstruction, but who will own the land on that? How will be the reconstruction of this area? Who will be in charge of that? Would it be the regulation? All of these are questions that to be addressed. Over.
Thank you, Michele. I hear a lot of commonalities between the different responses. One being that the port blast was not ground zero, that we have to deal with decades of a country falling apart prior to that. And your point about instructing donors on what to spend their donations on is something really important, because as you said, the minute there is a crisis that gets a lot of attention, this is where most of the funding goes immediately. The problem is it's not a sustainable way. And the longer the crisis goes, the harder it is to sustain this kind of funding. And what it does is, the danger of that is that it puts certain communities who are vulnerable ahead of other communities who are vulnerable. Yeah, we can talk about that for hours, but like, thank you for your positive hope that this is a moment for change, be it through what we learned from the pandemic, or through this port blast, or through these different efforts, or it is definitely a moment for change. And this is why we're trying to keep the conversation alive, especially being from afar. It's important to, it's one way for us to stay engaged. I see that Serge has a question, also a contribution, and after that, we're going to move to the second question.
Thank you, Maureen. I would react on 2 points very quickly. The first is about this model of kind of now recovery, reconstruction, is generated gaps. And I'll give a sample, which is quite caricatural, just to make things tangible. So you have sometimes some of the NGOs, because this also answers the question about how people reacted and what were according to their expectation and what were their reactions. So sometimes some NGOs really worked in a very comprehensive way, and they really answered they were capable of adapting to the needs. Some came with some very specific entry points. And you ended up, and this is a caricature, definitely don't take it necessarily as such. So for example, somebody is kind of rehabilitating windows, some other doors. So you end up with some apartments that are kind of well rehabilitated, but the stairs that leads to those apartments is left aside and is not rehabilitated. So we ended up facing sometimes situations, again, this is really a caricature, but sometimes we found gaps, and those gaps, due to the severe economic conditions, inhabitants were not able kind of to fill the gaps themselves, and the state not intervening, so he's not filling those gaps neither, okay? So you can imagine the level of frustration of people in those neighborhoods, that they want to come back, okay? Even though they're facing trauma, some of them didn't come back due to the trauma, so they want to come back, but nevertheless, they're not capable of going back. Another thing, just to extend what Philippe was saying, and I agree totally with what he was saying, but I would say that Solidaire experience learned us that even if the private sector is present and strong and willing and aware, if the public sector is absent, the reconstruction will never happen completely to the benefit of the inhabitants and population. And we've gone through this. So Michele, yes, you're completely right. We should learn from those experiences. And this is why from the beginning, we're saying we cannot do without the state. They need to assume their responsibilities, not only for the later phase, but because the model of reconstruction itself won't be fair, won't be just, won't take into consideration what are their needs. And we've been through this process before, and unfortunately, we're in a way reproducing that. And especially now on the port, I'm very much afraid that the model of reconstruction, if it happens now, within the very weak model of governance that we have, within this very high level of vulnerability that we're facing, we might end up again with a model that is not at all in favor of the inhabitants and the long and the sustainable development of those areas. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I think somehow your answers just channeled our second and third questions. So we discussed a lot about the relationship of resident to resident and to the state, and Serge at the end, like, it is important to have the state involved. So we're gonna skip to the fourth question, since we touched on these topics. And if you feel like elaborating anyone more on these topics, please go ahead. As a relatively newly formed nation state with limited resources, a dysfunctional political system, and under constant threats from opposing regional regimes and ideologies, Lebanon has been surviving on foreign aid to sustain itself, which has put the country and its people at the mercy of foreign oil, and sometimes at direct and indirect foreign intervention. Do you think these localized projects can plug into a wider regional project that protects the interests of Lebanese residents and neighboring communities? So I think maybe Ilyas can jump in as well. Yara, maybe you can talk about the experiences and how to connect with Haiti and other areas worldwide and try to create alliances, and everyone else is welcome to.
Okay, yeah, I can start. So one word that comes up in multiple of the questions is the interests. The public's interests, the interests of Lebanese residents, etc. We think that doing politics is defining what these interests are. So think about any sectoral measure that you might take today to try to fix things. Any such measure would kind of invariably help some people more than others. So for example, measures that you would take in education might favor the public education sector and hurt the interests of the private education sector, which in turn hurts the interest of kind of certain, certain churches, certain, etc., and so on and so forth. And so as part of political work, we should first define what these interests are. And that, of course, is there's no kind of right or wrong or, systematic, methodic answer to get there. That is where political choices, what we think matters more as part of our political beliefs, comes into play. And so without such a definition, we risk of falling into a pitfall of thinking that interests are very well defined, trying to do something towards that, and then finding out that actually we cannot satisfy all of the basic needs of everyone simultaneously, and thus we've kind of prioritized one group over the other, one region over the other, etc., just for the sake of practical feasibility. And so whenever the word public's interest or interest of Lebanese comes into play, I urge everyone to think of that as a political question. There's no right or wrong answer. You have to determine what your choices are. As for plugging into a wider regional project, there's to me, there's two aspects to that. Number one is, again, the time aspect. So we shouldn't be hoping for any kind of regional arrangement that's going to just come and be perfectly suitable. In fact, our history speaks to the complete opposite. Typically, these arrangements come at the expense of the Lebanese, with one of the major ones being the post-Civil War one, which was an agreement between the US, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and so on, which was, of course, really bad for Lebanon in many ways. And so were other arrangements. And even today's government is one regional arrangement with France as a main player and Iran and so on and so forth. So why should we count on such arrangements when we are not on that table in any shape or form? So we need to get on that table. To get on that table, you need to get in power, and to do so, you need to grow in strength and influence so that you can get there. And only then can we think of these interests, which we've at that point defined clearly, and the interests of external and foreign powers, and see where Lebanon could plug in which ways. And obviously, from the perspective of protecting our interests of both citizens and residents. And last, back to the time aspect, we are literally in a battle at this moment between kind of a new cabinet with lots of momentum and force, whose literal document in the cabinet formation process asks that says that it will pursue recent expats to their countries and try to figure out how they can get back remittances and capital from them. So the project is literally to get a couple 100,000 people out in the next year or two, so that there's more dollar inflow. That is simply the plan. That is it. And during this time, the banks will be refloated in a certain way that protects bank owners' interests. And we have a massive campaign in Citizens in a State at the moment on that front, which actually concerns the Order of Engineers and Architects and other syndicates whose mandatory savings have been essentially slashed away and effectively stolen by bank owners who've made tons of profits and at the expense of all these workers and their families. So time again comes into play, and we can't really afford to wait for anything for it.
So on a different kind of perspective from my own experience, like Haiti or also different African countries I worked in, I mean, the most successful initiatives when it came to like access to solar energy, but also I've worked with on education, on different initiatives. There was always the local initiative and really those bottom up solutions that, from at least what I saw, were the most successful. And I think the way we should look at foreign aid and at donors, and also, every single donor, they also have their own interests. I mean, I've worked with several different governments, and each one have their different, personal interest or constraints, but the way we should look at them is there are many, donors that are willing to help the private sector and private sector initiative, where they see that there is really sustainability, employment, like different really kind of social impact and, measures, indicators. So I think what's really important, and I've seen that in Lebanon as well. I worked on a project where we're trying to show that the company, that private sector company, was hiring, maintaining jobs. We're doing, all those different steps for climate change, for, different social positive impact. And I think the way we should look at it is really push those local initiatives and help trying to create those linkages between like donors, programs, and the private sector, and see and really see how they can work together. And that's how I see we can bring, it's more kind of a bottom up solution in some programs. So yes, so I think that should be part of the solution, and we should look at foreign aid and donor aid as really complementary. It could be technical assistance, it could be grant funding, it could be debt funding. I mean, there are different types of aid available out there that's kind of more long-term. And obviously the way to track it and to make sure it's sustainable are obviously like monitoring, evaluation of these type of initiatives, which are key. But yeah, that's...
Serge, you have your hand. Yeah.
Yes, actually, I would like maybe to answer to Marie-Jo Basile. So her question was, how can we as individuals help the public sector get stronger? This is very difficult. I don't know, as individuals, I don't know how I can answer that concerning the individuals, but I can talk about one of the very good experiences that happened or is still happening, and we can kind of start extracting some lessons learned from it, is the heritage reconstruction. For example, in that case, international funding institutions, agencies, countries, and so on, even UNESCO, kind of didn't bypass the Directorate General of Antiquities within the Ministry of Culture, who is in charge kind of these heritage buildings. They provided funds for technical assistance in parallel to the reconstruction process and efforts, and always required, and still do. Now we're working on a project with them on that. They always require that everything goes through the administration, and that the administration is the one in charge. So by doing so, they are reinforcing the role, and they are helping us kind of to play this, to play the game through these rules, which is keep reinforcing the institutions. We as individuals, I can imagine that this is maybe a political answer now. Maybe Elias would like to rebound on that. But definitely there's need to change politically things, to empower us as individuals and to be able maybe to change the whole system. But this is another thing. I don't know, Marijo, if I answered your question.
I just want to jump in for a second to react to what Yara just talked about the local initiatives, and also what you talked about, Serge. I think what we did in the studio was to try to focus on local initiatives. We looked at several scales of work. Like this conversation is really on a political policy level, but the studio looked at how one could empower neighborhood organizations so that they could now, instead of the NGOs or link with the NGOs or link with the donors, they could implement small projects which would essentially build up the community. So I really resonate with that, or we really resonate with what you're talking about. Several years ago in Cuba, they were about to fund a Pan American Games. What the government did was essentially to give these local individuals or neighborhood organizations technical help to build the housing for the games. And then once the games were over, those buildings or those housing types were then given back to those individuals. So there was a scale of actually getting government help, technical help, getting NGOs involved, and eventually getting it down to the community. So I totally think that if there's more emphasis on, of course, the government is very, very important, and they have to be in sync with this kind of thinking of getting local community agencies, giving them agency, you could get a lot more growth. And that's what I think a lot of our students try to do in the report.
Okay, I think we're running over time. Any final comments before we end the discussion?
I know there's no straight line here. It's on so many levels, on so many scales, in so many different ways, from so many different places. And that's what makes it really rich, but also disheartening that that Lebanon is suffering so much at the moment. But yeah, to Iyad's point, we can talk about this for hours, of course. But do you have any closing comments or final thoughts you'd like to share with everyone before we end?
I think that on a kind of the positive note here, I think as one of us mentioned, I think Lebanese people are very innovative. They're very they always come up with solution. I mean, whoever's been to Lebanon know that there's always a solution. And I feel that the diaspora is also very involved. Any Lebanese living outside Lebanon will still somehow have a link with Lebanon. So I think if there is a way to leverage that and to use, the Lebanese, brain and to collectively kind of find a way to work together, even with the diaspora, I'm sure there must be a solution.
Thank you, Yara. Amina, do you have, I felt you felt you wanted to say something?
Yeah, this has been a very interesting conversation. And I think a takeaway from, all of these lessons learned is that at least we have, built a lot of experience, learning, capacity, knowledge, from all of these events. Thank you.
Yeah, I think what's important and why do we keep doing these events is to bring people from different disciplines and backgrounds to have a conversation, because as like architects and designers, we always think we have the answers, but we don't have the answers. We really need to engage with other disciplines, politicians, activists, ecologists, economists, like all of these disciplines. And I really encourage all the students and architects to keep the conversation happening. Like if we really want to make a change, like we need to engage with other disciplines.
Go for it, Michele.
Yeah, I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for the invitation, because I was living a bit in Lebanon, so it's always a great pleasure to be involved when talking about the country. And, just what if I can give a suggestion that it's actually also what we are doing now with this new, WHO network. At least I'm finding that it's much easier to change big institutions, and when you are talking and starting from the technical perspective, so that is actually change a lot the life of the people. That should be our main point, right? I don't know. If I was working a lot in the Palestinian camp, in Beirut, for example, there are a lot of technical modification that you can do it. Electricity, water, ventilation. Already, if you tackle these three, you improve the life of people with huge impact. And of course, when you are talking about small technical initiative, basically it's much more easy because you are not under the radar to be blocked. When you just started to take it can be parallel, but if you started to take the discussion at much higher level into a political and policy level, is of course a much longer way to go. That have to be done, but we cannot wait for that to improve the life of people. So I think it's this I think would be one of my suggestion for some of you that they are in Lebanon or for the diaspora or yeah. And I think this is what we are trying to do with and it's very interesting because, for example, everyone wants to collaborate with us because we are the technical people, right? And there is not anymore political problems within the department, different UN agencies, different ministry all over the world, because we are giving technical support. So I think it could be two parallel things. One talking about policy and political decision. The other things, you are going into really almost the life-saving that is not response because it's the development of a country and development of economy. Because, for example, I hear some of you talking about solar power or clean energy. This is stay with the people for long time. And if you capacity build the people to basically manage this or to deal with that, it can become a business for them. So it's not just giving them something. Over.
Thank you so much, Michele, for that final comment. It's actually a great wrap up, which represents many of our panelists here. You know, we have Manal working on, lighting, and it's this very technical way of doing activist work. Amina through Impact Lebanon as well. Yara working in humanitarian situations and trying to bring lessons learned from different places. Serge working on the regional level of master planning and rethinking how to connect neighborhoods together, and Elias probably hovering and thinking more of a that political level, which is going to definitely take much more time. And I agree with your comment. The technical stuff can really help people, better people's lives very quickly. But of course, without the right policies in place, all of these technical solutions are very futile and they can disappear overnight if there's nothing really to, like a solid policy behind it to back it up. And that was really where the question for this event started. Like, how do we turn these short-term, ad hoc initiatives and these efforts of, brilliant people like yourselves who are working from different parts of the world to just help in any way you can and putting your expertise in any way you can to help at any level, and having in mind that actually it's very complex. It will take time, but we're seeing some progress. In Lebanon, I would say we've never stopped seeing progress. We've always just stood up and kept walking. And I love this about my country. And I love this about your work and how it's, being showcased here. And we would be very happy to continue this conversation in future events and future collaborations. Please stay connected, and I'm sure this event will provide exposure of your work to other people around the world who may end up connecting with you or reaching out to us to connect with you. And we would love to, keep this network growing. Thank you all for joining us, Iyad and I and the collective. Thank you for Dean Amal Andravos for making the time to be here. Thank you for Professor Richard and Professor Victor for giving us the time and space and the first bump up through their studio and pushing this further through the publication and engaging more stakeholders. And I know it's very late in Lebanon right now, so thank you again, everyone, and